Welcome to Night Stories, where shadows whisper, nightmares crawl, and every tale drags you deeper into the dark. If you dare to listen, leave the lights off and let the night begin. I never meant to get pulled into it. It started the way so many things do these days. Late at night, in the blue glow of my laptop, with a cup of coffee I didn't need, and a vague restlessness I couldn't shake. I was supposed to be working. At least that was the excuse. Proofreading a report, answering emails, making sure the week was squared away before bed. But I drifted, as I always do, to the darker corners of the internet, where the noise fades and the strange things float to the surface. That's where I found the first thread. It wasn't remarkable at first glance, just another one of those image boards where anonymity is its only defining feature. No usernames, no reputations to cling to. A place where people throw things into the void. Usually memes, grainy pornography, sometimes old internet folklore rehashed for the 100th time. But this thread was different. It began with a single photograph, a woman standing at a bus stop in the rain. She wasn't facing the camera, just standing there with her umbrella tilted slightly forward, her posture tired, resigned. I almost scrolled past it, until I noticed something about the clarity of the image. It wasn't posed. It wasn't stylized. It was raw, ordinary, almost painfully mundane. The sheen of wet asphalt, the peeling paint on the bus stop sign, the way her shoe had sunk slightly into a crack in the pavement. It looked real. Too real. The replies weren't what I expected. No jokes, no vulgar comments, just others posting more images. A man sweeping the floor of a diner, his head bent with the weight of a life I could only guess at. A boy sitting on the curb outside a laundromat, his eyes downcast, holding a plastic bag like it carried something fragile. An elderly woman in her kitchen, mid-motion, dust hanging in the sunlight. Thousands of them. Thousands of little windows into lives I shouldn't have been able to see. And none of them, not one, looked posed. I stared longer than I should have, clicking through image after image, my curiosity mounting into something sharp, uncomfortable. It wasn't the voyeurism that unsettled me. It was the feeling that I should recognize someone. That if enough photographs of strangers were dumped in front of me, eventually I'd see a face I knew, a neighbor, a co-worker, someone I passed on the street. But I didn't, not once. I closed the thread eventually, shaken but unable to articulate why. I told myself it was just one of those odd internet phenomena. Someone's art project, a prank, maybe a collective story experiment. That's what I believed, until the day I showed the thread to Morgan. Morgan was the only friend I trusted with this sort of thing. We'd met back in college, both of us drifting toward the quiet corners of the library when the world outside felt too loud. She was meticulous, the kind of person who noticed things others missed. Now she worked as a paralegal, and she carried that same instinct for evidence into everything she touched. We were sitting in her apartment when I brought it up. The room smelled faintly of coffee grounds and the lavender detergent she used on her blankets. A muted crime show played on the TV, its dialogue just background noise. "I found something online," I said, trying to sound casual. She arched an eyebrow. "That's never a good start." I pulled out my laptop and navigated back to the thread. The images had multiplied since I'd last checked. Entire galleries of them, hundreds of new faces. Morgan leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, her eyes narrowing. "This is unsettling," she said after a few minutes. "Right? It's not stock photography. The angles are too inconsistent. Different lighting, different grain. And it doesn't look like it's stolen from social media either. These people, they don't look like the type to post online." That line stuck with me. The people didn't look like the type. Ordinary faces marked by the kinds of lives that leave little trace. Men with weathered hands and tired eyes. Women whose clothes carried years of wear. Children in hand-me-down jackets. They looked like the people you passed in grocery stores, the ones you never noticed. Morgan sat back. "Do you see any watermarks?" "No, nothing, just the images." She clicked through another set, her expression tightening. "You know what's strange? I don't recognize any of these places. The bus stops, the diners, the apartments. They could be anywhere. And yet, they feel Close. Familiar but not identifiable. I nodded, relieved she felt it too. Like you've seen them before, but you can't place it. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she closed the laptop with a soft snap. The sound seemed loud in the small room. You should stop looking at this, she said finally. It's not healthy. But that night I couldn't stop. The next week blurred into long hours at work and longer nights back at the laptop. The images spread across multiple boards now, sometimes appearing in clusters, sometimes just one or two dropped into unrelated threads. Always the same style. Always the same impossible ordinariness. I started saving them. I told myself it was for research, that I was trying to piece together where they came from. But deep down, I knew it was compulsion. A need. The folder grew quickly, hundreds, then thousands. I categorized them by theme: work, leisure, domestic, transit. I zoomed in on backgrounds, hunting for street signs, advertisements, anything that might root them in a place. But the details were slippery. Street names blurred, faces caught mid-turn, clocks without hands. It was Morgan who pushed me over the edge. She called late one evening, her voice sharp with something I hadn't heard before. Fear. I've been looking too, she admitted. I shouldn't have, but I couldn't help it. I showed some of the photos to a friend who works in records. We tried to run checks, birth certificates, property ownership, anything. And nothing, these people don't exist. The silence between us stretched. My skin prickled, as if the room itself had grown hostile. You mean they're just unregistered? I asked weakly. No, I mean they aren't real. No digital footprint, no legal record, nothing. Like they were never born. I wanted to laugh, to tell her she was being dramatic, but I couldn't, because I had felt it too, that absence, that void. Morgan's voice dropped lower. Don't you see? Someone's documenting lives that were never lived, or maybe lives that were erased. A cold weight settled in my stomach. Stop digging, she added, almost pleading. Promise me. I didn't answer. The dream started a few nights later. I'd close my eyes and see the images projected against the backs of my eyelids. The diner, the bus stop, the laundromat. But now they weren't still photographs. They moved. The woman at the bus stop tapped her umbrella against the pavement. The boy outside the laundromat lifted his head. The man sweeping the diner looked up directly at me. I'd wake drenched in sweat, the silence of my apartment pressing in like a weight. The radiator hissed, the pipes clanged, the refrigerator clicked on and off. Suddenly, every sound felt intrusive, as though the building itself was restless. I stopped sleeping much at all. Instead, I went back to the archive, scrolling through endless faces. I began to notice patterns I hadn't seen before. Some of the people reappeared at different times, in different places. The boy outside the laundromat showed up weeks later in a grocery store aisle. The woman from the bus stop was later pictured in a dim living room, her umbrella propped against the wall. They were living their lives, or at least something like it. And that's when I saw her. At first I thought it was coincidence, just a resemblance, but the more I looked, the more certain I became. It was Morgan. She was sitting in her apartment, the same blanket draped over her couch, the same coffee mug on the table. Her face was turned slightly away, but I knew that profile, that curve of her jaw. I scrolled further, my breath catching. Another photo, her walking down her street, groceries in hand. Another, her at her desk, the glow of a computer screen on her face. All of them posted days, sometimes hours after I had been with her. My hands trembled as I picked up the phone, dialing her number. It rang and rang, no answer. I tried again. Nothing. Finally, her voicemail clicked on, her familiar voice chirping its usual greeting. But beneath it, just for a second, I swore I heard something else. A sound like a camera shutter. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the glow of my laptop, the folder of images open like a wound I couldn't close. Morgan's face stared back at me from a dozen angles, her life documented in stolen moments she had never chosen to share. I kept replaying her voicemail in my mind. That faint click, subtle but unmistakable, the mechanical snap of a shutter. I told myself it was just interference, some artifact of the recording. But the thought burrowed deeper. Someone was watching her. Someone was close enough to capture her voice, her movement, her silence. When the sun rose, pale and indifferent, I finally forced myself to move. My apartment felt hostile, each corner filled with the weight of observation. I unplugged my laptop, stuffed it into my bag, and walked the 20 minutes to Morgan's place. The streets were half awake, delivery trucks unloading crates, commuters trudging to buses with coffee in hand, the smell of baking bread bleeding out from the corner bakery. Everything looked painfully ordinary, which only made me more aware of how unordinary my thoughts had become. Morgan's building loomed at the end of the block, a brick structure with fire escapes climbing like scars up its face. I buzzed her apartment once, twice. No answer. I pulled out my phone and called again, straight to voicemail. My pulse quickened. She never let her phone die. She was the kind of person who carried a spare charger, who scolded me for letting mine drain below 50%. The building's front door was ajar, propped open by a folded pizza box. I hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The stairwell smelled faintly of damp concrete and the sour tang of someone's cooking gone bad. My footsteps echoed, sharp against the chipped tiles. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor. I knocked hard, the sound reverberating down the empty hall. Nothing. I tried the knob. Unlocked. The first thing that hit me when I stepped inside was the silence. Not the comfortable kind, but a hollow, abandoned silence, as though the air itself had been evacuated. Her blanket was still on the couch. The mug was still on the table. A faint brown ring at the bottom. The faint smell of lavender detergent lingered in the air, but it was stale, as though it hadn't been replenished in days. I moved through the apartment cautiously, each room amplifying the absence. Bedroom, bed unmade, a sweater draped across the chair. Bathroom, toothbrush damp, towel crumpled on the floor. Everything suggested she had just been there, and yet she wasn't. I felt it then, a prickling along the back of my neck, the sensation of being in a place after someone has left it, when the air still remembers them. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking. The battery was at 12%. I opened the folder of images and scrolled frantically. There she was again. A photo of her standing at her window, the city lights blurred behind her. Time-stamped 2 hours ago. 2 hours. I swallowed hard, every muscle in my body tight. Someone had been here. Someone had been close enough to capture that moment without her knowing. I backed out of the apartment, leaving the door half open, my heart pounding in my throat. For the next 2 days, I lived like a fugitive. I couldn't go to work, couldn't concentrate on anything but the images. The folder had doubled again. Now the photographs weren't only of strangers, they were of places I knew. My street. My bus stop. The little diner where I sometimes grabbed breakfast. And then buried among the faces I found myself. The first image was harmless enough. Me sitting in the cafe near my office, staring into my laptop, unaware. But the angle, it wasn't from across the room. It was closer. Too close. As though someone had been at the next table. Camera tilted just enough. The next one showed me leaving my apartment. Coat half zipped, expression tired. Another had me crossing the street, my hair caught by the wind. Each photo was mundane, ordinary, yet the terror of them lay in their ordinariness, in the knowledge that someone had been there, unseen, choosing not just to watch but to preserve. Stopped going outside. I taped black garbage bags over my windows, shoved a chair under my door handle, unplugged my laptop's camera. The air in my apartment grew stale and heavy, smelling of dust and old coffee. But even then, the images kept appearing. I don't know how they knew. Maybe it was my phone, maybe it was something else. But each night I'd refresh the thread and find more. Me sitting on my couch, staring blankly at the wall. Me sleeping fitfully, face half buried in a pillow. Me standing in the kitchen with the fridge open, light spilling onto my bare feet. Every detail captured, every moment stolen, and never once did I hear a sound. By the 3rd night, I stopped trying to sleep. I sat at my kitchen table, my phone in front of me, the dim hum of the refrigerator the only sound. My skin itched with awareness, as if thousands of eyes pressed against me from invisible places. At 3:12 a.m. my phone buzzed, a notification. New images uploaded. My throat tightened as I opened the folder. The first photo was of my kitchen, taken from the doorway. The second was closer, me sitting at the table, phone in hand, eyes wide. The third was taken from just behind me, the back of my head filling the frame. I froze. The phone slid from my hand, clattering against the table. The apartment was utterly silent, but I could feel it, the presence. A stillness that was not empty, but waiting. My eyes darted toward the darkened hallway, the shadows pressing thick against the walls. The garbage bags over the windows rustled faintly, as though stirred by a breath I couldn't feel. I forced myself to move. I grabbed the phone, the charger, my keys, and stumbled for the door. My chest was tight, every nerve screaming. The hallway outside was worse. It smelled of mildew and old paint, the flickering light casting everything in sickly pulses. My footsteps echoed too loudly as I descended the stairs, each one sounding like it belonged to someone else just behind me. When I finally reached the street, the cold air hit me like a slap. The city was quiet, too quiet, the streets washed pale by the yellow glow of street lamps. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I couldn't stay there. My phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Another photo, not of me this time, of Morgan. She was standing in the same street I was on. Same lamps, same cracked pavement. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, as though she had been drained of everything that made her her. And behind her, blurry, indistinct, but there, a figure, tall, featureless, watching. I'd been with the Missing Persons Bureau for 16 years, and I thought I'd seen every variation of loss that people could conjure. Runaways, estranged families, drug debts gone sour. Most cases had patterns, ugly but predictable. But when the file on Morgan Tate landed on my desk, nothing about it felt right. The initial report was simple enough. 32 years old, paralegal at a mid-sized firm. No history of mental illness, no debts, no enemies. Friends described her as steady, cautious, meticulous. One of them, her closest friend, had filed the report, though his statement read more like a confession. She told me to stop digging. I didn't. Now she's gone. I'd dealt with paranoia before. People see shadows and think they're being followed. Most of the time it's nothing. But the way he'd written it, the way his words seemed to stumble over themselves, it was different. I decided to take the case personally. I started, as always, at the apartment. The building was one of those aging bricks you find all over the city. 4 stories. Fire escapes dangling like broken ribs. Hallways that smelled of damp plaster and disinfectant. Morgan's unit was unlocked when I arrived, which set my teeth on edge. Inside, the air had that hollow quality I've learned to recognize. Not just absence, but abandonment, like the place had been drained of its purpose. The couch was rumpled. A coffee mug sat on the table with a brown ring hardened at the bottom. A sweater hung over the chair. Everything suggested she'd stepped out for a moment and never returned. That's always the worst kind of disappearance. I moved slowly, taking in the details. A faint scent of lavender clung to the blankets. The trash hadn't been taken out, though it wasn't overflowing. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, just stillness. And then I noticed the walls, not in any obvious way, no scratches, no writing, nothing like that. But as I moved through the rooms, I felt it. The subtle awareness that the walls weren't just enclosing space. They were holding it, containing it, almost possessively. I felt that sensation before, though I've never written it into a report. Some places don't just house people, they consume them. I shook it off, wrote my notes, collected the routine. Bank records, work logs, phone activity. All of it dead quiet after a certain point. No withdrawals, no emails, no calls. It was as if she'd been plucked out of her life mid-step. 2 days later, I interviewed her colleague at the law firm. The office was sterile in that corporate way. White walls, framed certificates, the faint chemical tang of overused carpet cleaner. The colleague, a man in his 40s with a polished smile that didn't reach his eyes, told me she was reliable, never late, careful with her work. But then his tone shifted. She'd been distracted the last few weeks, he said carefully, glancing at the recorder on my desk. Kept talking about photographs, that someone was watching her. At first, we thought it was a client issue, maybe harassment. But she wouldn't give details, just said there were too many faces. Did she ever show you? I asked. He hesitated. His eyes flicked toward his office door as if he was afraid of something beyond it. Finally, he shook his head. No, and I'm glad she didn't. The statement gnawed at me, so I went digging. Back at the bureau, I requested her internet records. What I found didn't make sense. Hours, sometimes entire nights, logged into anonymous boards, most of which weren't even indexed by normal search engines. Threads with thousands of photographs attached. The IT division pulled samples for me. They sat on my desk in a thick manila folder, black and white printouts of grainy images. At first glance, they were nothing. Ordinary people doing ordinary things. Waiting for buses, cooking, walking home with groceries. But the longer I looked, the heavier the air around me seemed to grow. The people in the photographs didn't have names. I mean that literally. We ran facial recognition across every database we had access to. Licenses, passports, criminal records, even obituaries. Nothing. It was impossible. And then I noticed something worse. In the middle of the stack, printed faintly but unmistakably, was a photograph of Morgan, standing at her apartment window, time-stamped less than 12 hours before the report of her disappearance. That night I couldn't bring myself to go home. Instead, I stayed at the office, the file spread across my desk, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above. I stared at those photographs until my eyes burned. They unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. The faces weren't remarkable, but they weren't generic either. Each one carried the detail of a real life. Lines etched into skin, scars, asymmetries that no computer could fabricate. These weren't composites, they were people, and yet they weren't. The realization came slowly, like an itch at the back of my mind. None of these people had histories. They were fragments without a whole, appearances without existences. Empty identities. At 2:47 a.m., the office fell silent. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, that makes you suddenly aware of your own breathing. I glanced up and froze. The photographs had shifted. I swear it. I had left them spread across the desk in one arrangement, but now the order was different. The one of the man sweeping a diner was on top, though I remembered burying it halfway down. The boy outside the laundromat was closer, his gaze angled differently, as though he'd turned between one glance and the next. Told myself it was exhaustion, stress, a trick of memory. But then I saw it. At the bottom of the pile, half covered by another sheet, was a new photograph. One I hadn't seen before. My office. The angle was unmistakable. The desk, the humming fluorescent lights, the half-empty coffee cup at my elbow. And in the center of the frame, me. Head bent over the file, taken from just behind my shoulder. My chest tightened. The hair on my arms rose. I stood, spinning toward the door, the corners of the office. Empty. The silence pressed harder. I gathered the photographs with shaking hands, stuffed them back into the folder, and locked it in the cabinet. But that did nothing to slow my pulse, nothing to erase the feeling that whoever, or whatever, was compiling these images had now noticed me. And once noticed, I suspected you couldn't be unseen. I took the case home after that. Not officially, but in my own way. I couldn't bring myself to trust the bureau. Too many eyes, too many ways for things to slip into the wrong hands. Instead, I pinned the photographs to the wall of my spare room, covering it in faces. Hundreds of them. They stared back at me with blank ordinariness, their lives suspended in stolen fragments. Some nights I sat there until dawn, studying them, tracing connections. Certain faces reappeared across different contexts. At the bus stop one day, in a grocery store weeks later. They aged, they moved, they lived. And yet they didn't exist. The contradiction gnawed at me, burrowed into my sleep. I began to dream of them, not as photographs, but as people moving soundlessly through streets, through kitchens, through laundromats. Always turning, always pausing as though aware of the lens, and always just out of frame, something else. I woke once with the metallic taste of blood in my mouth, my nails bitten down to the quick. I knew then, this wasn't just a case anymore. It wasn't even just about Morgan. Whatever had taken her was spreading, and now it had me. The breakthrough came by accident. I was scanning another set of uploads, faces I didn't recognize, moments that felt both meaningless and heavy, when I froze. There, in the corner of one photograph, reflected in a shop window, was the shape of a man, not clear, not distinct, just a blurred figure holding something to his face. Camera. Finally, a shadow of the collector. I zoomed in, but the resolution was poor. The more I enlarged it, the more it dissolved into pixels. Yet something about the stance, the posture, the stillness, made my skin crawl. Because it wasn't the stance of someone taking a snapshot. It was the stance of someone waiting, patient, endless, and I realized with a chill that rooted me to the chair that it wasn't just me who was searching for him. He was searching for me. I didn't go home after seeing that photograph of Morgan on the street. I couldn't. The city had become hostile in a way I couldn't name, each shadow too deep, each passerby a potential witness or predator. Instead, I wandered. Blocks blurred into one another, shuttered storefronts, the sickly yellow of sodium lamps, sidewalks littered with crushed coffee cups and flyers bleeding ink from the damp. My phone felt heavy in my pocket, its glow poisonous whenever I pulled it out. Because every time I checked, there were more photographs. Of me. Sometimes I was in them minutes after I'd done the thing depicted, walking past the old bakery on 12th Street, pausing under the flicker of a broken lamp, sitting on a bench I couldn't even remember choosing. Other times, the photographs came before I arrived, images of me in places I hadn't yet been. Then, hours later, I'd find myself there without knowing why. It wasn't just documentation anymore. It was direction. I was being moved, ushered by unseen hands through the city like a piece on a board. By dawn, I ended up at a motel on the edge of town. It was the kind of place you only chose if you were desperate, where the wallpaper peeled in long strips and the air carried the stale sweetness of cigarette smoke burned into the carpet. I paid in cash. The clerk barely looked at me, which was what I wanted. His television muttered something about morning traffic while I carried my bag down a narrow hallway that smelled of bleach and mildew. The room itself felt less like a place to sleep and more like a holding cell. The curtains were thin, doing little to block the bleary sunlight, and the bed sagged in the middle as if it had been swallowing people for decades. I pulled the desk chair into the center of the room and sat there, my phone clutched tight in my hand. I told myself I wouldn't check, that I'd let the images sit, that ignoring them would break whatever spell they had over me. But of course I looked. The newest photograph was of the motel room, taken from the corner by the window. I shot up so fast the chair toppled backward, my chest tightening with a sharp pain. The curtains swayed slightly, though the window was shut. My eyes darted around the room, the bathroom door half open, the wardrobe dark as a throat, empty, but the image had been taken. I closed the phone, shoved it under the pillow and sat on the bed with my head in my hands. My skin buzzed with the kind of exhaustion that isn't physical but spiritual, the hollowing out of something vital. For the first time, I thought of Morgan not as a friend who had been taken, but as a warning. And I realized with a slow and terrible certainty that if I stayed here, if I stayed anywhere, they would eventually have me too. By the second night at the motel, I stopped leaving the room. The outside world had become hostile, thick with implication. Every cough in the next room, every shuffle of footsteps down the hallway could have been him, the figure I'd glimpsed behind Morgan. Instead, I let the hours blur into one another, watching the light fade and return, my phone always within reach. That's when the sound began. It was subtle at first, a faint mechanical click, almost too soft to notice. It came at odd intervals, never rhythmic, like the shifting of an old pipe. I tried to convince myself it was the building. But deep down I knew. The sound was the same one I'd heard in Morgan's voicemail. The sound of a shutter. Sometimes it came from the corner of the room, sometimes from the bathroom. Once, unmistakably, from just behind my head. Every time my phone buzzed a moment later. New image uploaded. Me in the same position I'd been in seconds before. My throat went raw from holding back the urge to scream. On the third day, I cracked. I opened the bathroom mirror cabinet, found the flimsy motel razor, and shaved the stubble from my face until my skin burned raw. I pulled on a different shirt, cut my hair unevenly with the scissors from the first aid kit, trying to change myself into someone unrecognizable. But when the next photograph appeared, the changes were already there. I was captured mid-motion, razor at my cheek, eyes hollow. The angle perfect, as though he'd been inside the mirror itself, watching. I dropped the phone. The sound echoed in the bathroom, sharp and final. That's when I knew there was no running, 'cause wherever I went, he was already there. I tried calling Morgan again, though I knew it was useless. The call went to voicemail, her bright practiced tone greeting me like a ghost. I stayed on the line, listening hard, waiting for the background noise. And there it was. Not faint this time. The shudder, clear and deliberate, followed by something else. A breath, slow, steady, close to the receiver. I ended the call and hurled the phone against the wall. The plastic cracked, but the screen stubbornly lit up, pulsing with a new notification. I forced myself to look. It wasn't a photograph this time, it was a video. The perspective was my motel room, the camera angle low from near the foot of the bed. I watched myself, sitting there, hunched, staring at the broken phone. The video lasted only a few seconds, but in the last frame, just before it cut to black, the camera shifted, tilted upward. And in the reflection of the darkened television screen, I saw him. Not in focus, not enough to make out a face, but tall, still, featureless, as though the figure itself was a gap in the world, a hole where a person should be. I dropped the phone again, my body rigid with terror. My pulse thundered in my ears, my skin clammy and cold. The room seemed to close in on me, the thin curtains pressing inward, the shadows swelling in the corners. I could feel him there, patient, waiting, as if the space itself was no longer mine. And for the first time, I understood what had happened to Morgan. She hadn't just been taken, she had been replaced. That night I tried not to sleep, but exhaustion pulled me under. The dreams were sharp, metallic, edged with the smell of rain on pavement. I was standing at a bus stop, umbrella tilted forward, posture tired. Across the street, the diner flickered with neon. When I turned, I saw the boy at the laundromat, the man sweeping the floor, the elderly woman in her kitchen. They were all there, silent, watching, and behind them, filling the street, the tall figure stood, waiting. When I woke, the motel room was silent, the kind of silence that presses into your bones. I reached for my phone with a trembling hand. One new photograph, not of me this time, of the wall above the bed, and scrawled across the wallpaper, in the same gray, unfocused blur that always obscured him, were 4 words. "You are almost ready." The file cabinet in my spare room was locked, but it didn't matter anymore. The photographs didn't stay in it. I'd wake to find them scattered across the floor, the faces rearranged into patterns I didn't recognize. Circles, rows, sometimes spirals that seemed to twist inward if I stared too long. I'd stopped sleeping in there, but the images bled through the house anyway. On the kitchen table, the bathroom sink, once tucked neatly under my pillow like a gift. The bureau didn't know. Or maybe they did, and they just didn't want it on paper. My colleagues had begun to look at me differently, their smiles tight, their eyes averting just a second too quickly, as if they sensed something leaking from me they didn't want to name. The worst part was that the photographs had moved past strangers. Now they were of me. The first was small, me leaving the bureau, briefcase in hand. Then one of me pouring coffee in my kitchen. Another, my reflection in the bathroom mirror. Each time the angle was wrong, slightly higher or lower or behind, always behind. And then came the one I couldn't forget, me at my desk, head bent over the case file, and behind me in the darkened window's reflection that same tall figure, featureless, waiting. I began drinking too much after that. Whiskey dulled the edge, but it never erased it. I thought maybe if I kept myself numb, I could slip beneath their notice. That maybe they wanted fear, and if I stopped feeding them, they'd lose interest. But I was wrong. The photographs didn't slow, they multiplied. Each morning, I'd check the file and there would be more. One showed me asleep at the kitchen table, a bottle tipped over beside me. Another, me unlocking my car, my face pale in the overhead light. And then, last night, I woke to the sound of my printer humming in the dark. The machine whirred steadily, feeding out page after page. I stood in the doorway, paralyzed as the paper piled onto the carpet. When it finally stopped, I forced myself to look. Dozens of photographs, all of me, each frame closer than the last, until the final one, which was nothing but the back of my head, and just over my shoulder, the faint blur of a hand. I haven't been back to the bureau since. The file sits untouched, but the photographs keep coming anyway. I don't know if they're sent to me or if they just appear. The distinction doesn't matter anymore. All I know is this: Morgan was only the beginning. And the person who reported her missing, the friend, he's in them too now. I've seen his face among the stacks, pale, frightened, always looking over his shoulder. The photographs are drawing us together, not for justice, not for truth, for erasure. The narrator. The words on the motel wall blurred in my vision. You are almost ready. I sat there for hours, knees pulled to my chest, my mind scraping at itself like a dull blade. Ready for what? For them? For him? The phone kept buzzing, each time another photograph. One of me standing at the window, though I hadn't moved. One of me with my head in my hands, though I hadn't lifted them. One of me asleep, though I wasn't. The line between my body and the images had dissolved. They weren't documenting anymore. They were dictating. By the second night, I couldn't fight it. Hunger gnawed at me. Thirst dried my mouth, but I stayed perfectly still, as though moving outside their script would be punished. And then at 3:04 a.m., the phone buzzed again. Not a photograph this time. A message, just 2 words. Step outside. I don't know why I obeyed. Maybe because I was too tired to resist, or because a deeper part of me knew resistance was pointless. The hallway was silent, the carpet damp beneath my bare feet. The air smelled faintly of mold and something sharper, like film developer, acrid and metallic. I walked to the end where the exit door led to the parking lot. My hand shook as I pushed it open. Cold air rushed in, and the world outside seemed emptied. No cars, no people, just the glow of a flickering street lamp and the dark outlines of trees beyond. And him, the figure, tall, indistinct, featureless, waiting under the lamp. For a long time I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat, my body frozen. Then my phone buzzed again. I lifted it slowly. The screen showed me, standing in the doorway, looking out. And in the corner of the frame, closer than I realized, the blur of his hand reaching forward. The investigator. It's morning now. I haven't opened the blinds. On the floor beside me, another stack of photographs has appeared overnight. The top one shows me sitting here in the half-light, pen scratching across this page. I don't know who I'm writing for. Maybe for the bureau, maybe for no one, maybe for him. What I do know is this. Once you've been seen, you can't return to being unseen. The photographs become your shadow, your history rewritten frame by frame. I keep thinking about Morgan's friend, about how our lives are running parallel, drawn by the same invisible hand toward the same vanishing point. We'll never meet, we'll never compare notes. Because the moment we would, we'd both be gone. The photographs don't want survivors, they want archives. And soon I'll be nothing more than another face among them. The narrator. I don't remember walking to him. I don't remember the cold of the night air or the way the street lamp buzzed faintly overhead. I only remember the shutter. Click, 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 each sound carving me smaller, hollowing me out, until there was nothing left but the image. The investigator. The last photograph in the stack is different. Not of me, not of Morgan, of a man I don't recognize. He's standing under a street lamp. His face is pale, eyes wide, hollow. And behind him, the blur of a figure, hand on his shoulder. The timestamp is from tonight, right now. Thank you for listening. Hope you didn't get too scared. If you want to listen more stories, check out my channel. Please leave a like and subscribe. It means the whole world to me.